Hey guys, welcome back to the Passing Moments of Existence podcast, episode 2. Today we're going to talk about greed. I think that it's a really important topic right now, given the political climate of what's been going on with the news about the United Healthcare CEO being gunned down in New York City. Following that, there has been a lot of talk of class disparity, and a lot of people on social media are talking about this class consciousness that we all seem to be getting on board with, and that we really are not necessarily supposed to be fighting against each other, but really a few select people in our society that have an extreme amount of wealth. And that's why I think greed is an important conversation today, because of what's been going on. And that's what I want to talk to you about, because greed, funny enough, is a huge piece of Theravada Buddhist practice. And as you know, on this Passing Moments of Existence podcast, that's what we talk about: Dhammic and Theravada practice, philosophy, and psychology, and how we can use these understandings, these ancient teachings, in our modern day lives. Furthermore, it's only a few days till Christmas, and the opposite of greed is generosity. So I think it's a great time to talk about these two things, and that's what we're going to discuss today. If you're unfamiliar with this podcast, the Passing Moments of Existence podcast is a podcast about Theravada practice, about that psychology and philosophy of it that I mentioned, and how we can apply into our daily lives. And the truth is that every moment is passing in this existence, and that if we cling to it, we will suffer. And that's why I named it this. And with today's topic, I think that we can jump right in, because it's something that we should attack as quickly as possible. And that's what this is all about. Because once you listen to this podcast, my goal is that you will understand greed at its nature, at its core, at the root. And from there, we can begin to understand it in a way that gives us new enlightened perspectives. And then from there, gives us new understandings on how we can attack it and how we can change this greedy society, this society that favors people who step on others, this society that favors corporate greed, and this capitalistic society that does not help a majority of its citizens. So, the first thing that we're going to dive into now is the understanding of what is known as kusalas or kusalas. What that basically translates to is unwholesome or wholesome mind states. If you're familiar with Buddhist practice, you know that the state of mind is probably one of the most important parts of your practice, because depending on your state of mind will depend on how you speak and how you act. Now, the Buddha taught us that we want to have and cultivate wholesome mind states. He also called this wisdom. I also like to look at this as good. The opposite of this would be unwise, unwholesome, or potentially even evil mind states. Now, there are 3 roots of evil mind states, and there are 3 roots of good or wholesome mind states. Today, we're simply going to be talking about one of each. And funny enough, the 2 that we're going to be talking about are the opposite of the other. So, the first is greed. Greed is one of the unwholesome mind states, one of the 3 poisons or 3 roots of evil in Buddhist practice. It is said that these 3 roots of evil are the reason people do bad things. If anything is done that is bad to another person, or just done bad in general, it's because of one of these 3 roots of evil. Now, the opposite of greed is generosity. So while we have this poison over here of greed, its antidote is generosity. And this is super important to understand, because in a moment or later in this podcast, once we understand greed, I'm going to give you some examples of how greed can take over our own minds, and how we can use generosity to quell or to, provide an antidote to this poison that can take over our own minds. So, like I said, we have the akusala, or the unwholesome state of mind, and one of these unwholesome states of mind is greed. It's important, though, to really know that greed, or this unwholesome state of mind, is simply a reaction to sensation. In Buddhist philosophy, this is a bit heavier, but in Buddhist philosophy, we have pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral sensations. Think about it for a second. Every time you experience something, it's one of these 3 types of sensations. Whether you see a beautiful sunset that is a pleasant sensation, or you taste some bitter food that is an unpleasant sensation, or you're sitting down and you're not really feeling pleasant or unpleasant sensations at all, and it's simply just a neutral sensation. So, what the Buddhist said, or what Buddhist practice says, is that we have a reaction to these sensations. And depending on our reaction being wholesome or unwholesome, will depend on if we are experiencing this evil. Now, I want you to understand that, because as we move forward, we're going to apply our reactions, this greedy reaction that we may have to a sensation, and how it leads to suffering. So, another way to look at greed is that it is a virus, okay? And funny enough, it's a virus that all of us have. Now, was it there when we first were born? I'm not here to debate that or discuss that. But what I am here to say is that regardless, we can unlearn greed. And rather, we can take the antidote of generosity to quell this greed. And I also believe, personally, the more that we do this, the more we can change the world for future generations. Because if we can train our minds to be more generous and more kind to others, then perhaps passed down, we can give this characteristic trait to our children and to our children's children, and eventually build a planet and a human race that is more generous, that is more kind, and acts with wholesome mind states. But back to that greed being a virus. Some monks that I've read talk about greed also being like a boss. It's this virus, kind of like a parasite that comes and enters the body and kind of starts controlling the mind, kind of like in that movie Alien. I think they do that in that movie Alien. It enters the body and it becomes your boss, your superior that you constantly have to appease. The boss that says, I want this paper on my desk by Monday. So greed says that you constantly have to be appeasing it. And when it takes hold of you, you become extremely diluted and you really lose touch with the truth of this life. And this is important because if we lose touch with what's actually happening, we start to act more and more with unwholesome mind states. Again, this is we all have the ability to change how we perceive our life and how we perceive and how we react to sensations. So it's really good and important to remember that we have these sensations, we have a reaction to them, and we can change how we react to them. And this greed, this virus, we don't want to let it in, because once we let it in, it's really hard to get it out. Let's talk a little bit about how greed also is another just term for attachment. We talk about attachment a lot being the root of suffering in Buddhist practice. And greed is there's no excuse for greed either. Greed is another version of attachment. When we are greedy, we also ultimately suffer. And this is something I want you to ask yourself. You may be disagreeing with me, and I'd like to challenge you on this. Imagine you had an ice cream, and you finished that ice cream, but you wanted more, but you're not going to have more. That could be considered an unpleasant sensation, not having that ice cream. But perhaps that you haven't developed equanimity. You haven't developed being okay with that. You may start to experience that attachment or that greed for wanting more ice cream. And in that moment, does that attachment feel good? Does that attachment bring you peace and happiness? No. That attachment, that greed, is an unwholesome mind state, and it leads to our suffering. And I ask you also to contemplate in your meditation practice this week exactly what I'm saying right now. The last time that you experienced greed, or if you see yourself experience this greed, this attachment, does it feel good? These are the questions that we want to ask ourselves in our own practice, because as we know in Buddhist practice, because it really is a science, we have to have a hypothesis and we have to have an actual method for testing the things that the Buddha taught us. And when we do that, we can find that the answers are valid, that these truths are true, that these teachings are valid. Greed does lead to our suffering. However, if we had that ice cream and we finished that ice cream and we wanted more, but we decided to be generous and to let go of that attachment, to be generous and not greedy and not cling to that idea of wanting more ice cream, but actually be generous and let go of that idea. being like somebody who's volunteering at a homeless shelter, being generous with our time, or saying to yourself, maybe I should give that homeless man $5, and you end up doing that. You're being generous by letting go of this attachment that you have to wanting more ice cream. And in that, you liberate yourself from that suffering. So when you let go of that attachment, does that feel good or does that feel bad? Again, asking these questions, because once we do, we can start to understand these teachings for ourselves. We can actually have a self-investigation and then eventually a self-realization. Now, that's a good segue because a lot of times people think that greed is just money, right? We always want more money. But like I said, we could be greedy with ideas. We can be greedy with food. We can be greedy with, a person. We can be greedy with a thought. Or we also can be greedy a lot of times. I think ultimately what it comes down to is being greedy to a sensation. We have a pleasant sensation and we want more of it. We have an ice cream cone, we want more of it. We fantasize about having a romantic partner and we become greedy to it and we want more of it. As opposed to just letting that fantasy just come and go. We can have that fantasy of that romantic partner. We can enjoy it and then let it go. But instead, no, we cling to it. We cling to the ice cream. We cling to the fantasy. We cling to the money. Now, this is actually where I want to start talking a little bit about society, because now that we understand that we become greedy to sensations and that we become greedy to these pleasant sensations, this is where a lot of leaders in society kind of create a lot of problems. Because a lot of the 1% have plenty of money. So it's not that they're necessarily greedy with money, but really they're greedy for power. They're greedy for that sensation of getting, let's say, support or encouragement or rewards from their peers saying, wow, you've done such a good job. You made the stock price go up. Reward for their own internal feelings of, I finally did something good. I finally won the game of life, or I continue to win. To be on top, to be the richest man in the world, or to be a billionaire. And this goes on a psychological level so deep, because you have to also consider all these people that these billionaires are spending their time with. They're all constantly trying to race to the top. They're trying to step on each other, but at the same time, get to the top. They're trying to appease this greed, this virus that is never ending. It is deep within them. And unless they recognize and become mindful of it, they let the greed become the boss. And so a lot of times it's not greed for money at all, but it's greed for power. And they have these attachments, in these corporate spaces to make the quarterly business report be 2% higher in profits, or to make sure that their income level goes up the next tax bracket, or to make sure that, they don't have to pay as much in taxes because they went through enough loopholes, or to see their retirement go up a certain amount. It goes beyond money. And so greed really is also to be greedy, to be the best. And what's so funny is life is so dynamic that you'll never be the best. Even if you're the best for a moment, even if you're the richest man in the world, you won't be the richest man in the world forever. It's not permanent. And then you'll be chasing that again. And also, it goes without saying that just because you win or become the richest man in the world, that doesn't mean that you are ultimately happy. And I think that we all know that. There are many, many millionaires and billionaires that commit suicide all the time, even though they have everything as far as monetary gain goes. And it's because, they're ignorant, they're diluted, they don't know the truth. And that's what we're here to talk about a little bit more about today. So, again, greed and attachment are the same, and a lot of these leaders are attached to many different things that lead them to act in unwholesome ways. Their reaction to these pleasant stimuli or this unpleasant stimuli and sensations makes them act greedy. And when they act greedy, they cause pain for others and suffering for themselves. So again, another example of this would be, in our daily lives, we may see greed all of the time. We might have a partner or an ex, let's say, and we might say, that ex should have treated me better. They should have treated me better. Why didn't they treat me better? Well, in that moment, we're being greedy to the idea of having to be treated a certain way, or rather, being greedy to the fact that we weren't being treated a certain way. I'm not saying here that we can't advocate to be treated well by others. But what I am saying is our relationship to that experience decides if we suffer or not. That's where the greed comes in. So we can still advocate to be treated well. We can still choose a partner or set boundaries with other partners to make sure that we're being treated well. But how are we relating to it? Are we being greedy and saying we need to be a certain way, and if we're not, then we're going to be upset? Or are we saying we want this situation to be a certain way, and if I don't get that with this partner, that's fine. I will move on. I will set my boundary. I will make sure I advocate for my own self-worth, but I'm not going to let that experience dictate my happiness. And that's also where that whole let them theory comes in. You let go. You let go to this idea that things have to be a certain way, or rather that you're unhappy that they're not. You can still advocate for yourself. You can still say, hey, I need a person who supports me in this way. But we don't need to be unhappy when it doesn't happen. I hope that makes sense. If that's confusing, let me know. That might not have been the best example. You can leave a comment here on YouTube or also reach out to me on social media. So let's talk about also how not only does greed lead to our own suffering because we have this pleasant or unpleasant situation or sensation, and then we react to it, but also it leads to pain for others. And when we react to these situations, it really leads us to act in certain ways. What we ultimately should be doing is allowing these situations to just come and go, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But yeah, when a person acts upon greed, they're usually withholding this energy. They're withholding this ability to be generous. And I think that that's where we really see this class disparity in America happening, because when they want this greed, they ultimately make decisions that hurt others to appease the greed, to make the virus happy. And that's why we see this class disparity in America. Because for one, not only is the system built this way, but the people that are running the system, or the people that are at the top of this system, it favors them from a monetary state of mind and from a greedy state of mind to continue with acting this way. That's why the CEO for that United Healthcare was sending so many people away and declining so many of their insurance claims. He knew that the more he did that, the more money his corporation would make. So his greed, his constant wanting to appease the virus, his constant wanting for more is what led to this problem, which I guess is obvious. But it's important to understand that greed leads to suffering for ourselves and pain for others. Suffering for ourselves because we are now in this unwholesome mind state where we're constantly wanting more that can never be appeased. But at the same time, in doing that, we're stepping on others. And so it's really important. And from a systematic point of view, it's a really hard thing to fight, especially if you're not up there. So again, even if we had a CEO that was like Jesus or the Buddha, and all of a sudden just say, you know what, I'm gonna be more generous. I'm gonna be a better person. As soon as that would happen, they would be fired and be replaced with somebody more greedy. And that's why this is really important that we understand greed on a fundamental level, because it's not like we can just yell our way to a solution. It's not like we can just push our way to a solution or get this guy fired. We need to have conversations. We need to move as a movement, but we also need to do that in understanding what is really happening. So remember, if everybody else is being greedy at the top and all these CEOs are all just trying to make their bottom dollar go up, well, then everybody else is going to continue to be that way, and every other CEO is going to continue to be that way. So again, greed leads to our own suffering, and that's a bit of an advanced teaching, so I'm going to save that for another time, but just remember that. And also, it is, it's an important thing. Let's talk a little bit now about generosity. I think that's important because, again, we are in the Christmas season, and it's important that we're generous. The cool thing is that the opposite of greed, the antidote to these problems is generosity. Being more generous with every aspect of our lives, including these sensations that we experience. Generosity doesn't have to apply only to money. It can apply with time, with ideas, and even forgiveness. When we forgive somebody, we're actually being generous by allowing the person to be how they are. We are saying, you know what, while I don't agree with what you're saying, and I might not even want to be around you anymore, I forgive you. I accept that the way that you're acting is based on your own problems, and I myself will not partake in that negative energy, and I will move on from that. And it's super important because we also have this greed to ideas. And by forgiving a person, we are allowing them to be that way, or we're being generous with our pride. We're being generous to this attachment we have to the way they have to be. It's like, how can we force, a square block into a circular hole? We can't. And so ultimately we need to eventually let go of that idea and be more generous. So letting go and accepting something is ultimately generous in itself. And when we ourselves hold on to something, that is greedy. And that could be, again, it could be a $5 bill. It could be an idea. It could be a pleasant sensation. Maybe we experience a relationship that was really beautiful at a time, but we want more of it. We want more of that moment. Well, not we're being greedy. We need to be generous and allow that moment to come and go. If we have an idea, let's say, that guy that, that person was with, or, hey, I have this partner. If only they were like this more. If only they could be, a little bit, nicer to me in this way, or if they only understood things in this way, and they don't, and I'm really upset about that. That is our own suffering caused by our greed. We want it to be a certain way, and we're not letting go of this idea that it has to be a certain way. But if we just allow it to be what it is, we'll let go of the greed and we'll start practicing generosity because we're allowing it to be what it is. We don't need to force it. And in that, we end our own suffering in that moment. So letting go and accepting something is generous in itself. And if you don't believe me, I want you to try it. The next time that you feel suffering, that you feel uncomfortable, recognize, what is it that I'm holding on to? What is it that I'm attached to? Is there something that I can let go of in this moment? Is there something that I can be generous with? And that's why this time of year with Christmas is so important. I'm not religious, but this year my family does celebrate Christmas. And this year I've thought a lot about, what is it about Christmas? Why do we love it so much? And it's because it's a time to be generous. It's a time to be generous with, not only by giving gifts, but if you don't want to give gifts, be generous with your time. If you don't want to be generous with your time, be generous with your attachments. Let go of those attachments. Be generous and allow people to be the way they are. Be kind and be peaceful and be loving. And understand that the longer that you hold on to this idea that things need to be a certain way, the more you're going to suffer. And the more that you suffer, the more that you're going to cause pain for others because of how you're reacting. That's where we lash out to others. Why aren't you this way? When we should just let them be the way they are. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we can't have conversations with people. That doesn't mean that we can't set boundaries and say, hey, this is something that's bothering me. That doesn't mean that we can't come together as a society and fight against evil and unwholesome mind states. But it does mean that in those moments, we don't need to be enraged by it. We don't need to be overwhelmed by it. And this is the practice of equanimity. This is the practice of Buddhism, and understanding that we can be totally conscious of what is happening and at peace with it while still fighting against it. And this is how Jesus and the Buddha really are set apart when it comes to moral standings. It's about being kind and generous to others and being not greedy. We can change the world through generosity. The more that we are generous with ourselves and with others, the more we're leading by example. The more that we're saying, you know what, I'm going to fight up against corporate greed, but I'm going to do so in a way where I don't hold attachment to the idea that it needs to be this way, the more we can be at peace with ourselves in that process. And that's what this is really all about. So be generous with your pride. Forgive others and be kind to those who do us wrong. because they know not what they do, to quote Jesus. Thank you guys for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please let me know. If you have any questions about future episodes, please let me know. You can find me on social media. And if you also want to join the Discord group, I just relaunched it. You can find it in my link tree, where we talk about these things, but on a more personal level. So if you have questions about certain things in your life, you can come to these Discord meetings. Right now, they are donation-based. That might change one day in the future. A lot of the Dhamma that I provide online is free, but if you want to have a targeted approach where we do an actual coaching with what you're dealing with, that's where it does take a bit more of my time, and I am a layman, and I'm not a monk, and so I would like to be able to do this for a living down the line and support my community in ways that I can by giving out Dhamma for free, but also as a return, if you would like to support me, you can do that by donating. May you be well, may you be free of suffering, and thanks for listening. Merry Christmas to you, and be generous today.